And you can tell that we're both like nerd podcasters because both of us have our proper microphones.
I know. This is real.
It was like the first thing that one of my friends told me. She's like, you have to go buy a mic. She's like, it sounds dumb, but it's the first thing.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So welcome to the Lemme Splain podcast. We are here today with Al Dia, who is a thought leader in the space of management, leadership, and basically how to start to craft your career. And I think that's very interesting in terms of your career path, Al, considering that your career path until you started as an entrepreneur was, let's be honest, it was pretty cookie cutter, right?
Yeah, it was. And I think that part of that just stems, if I just really reflect back on this, of just growing up and looking around at what was in front of me and what was encouraged to me by very supportive and well-intentioned people and peers. In terms of the playbook, I think was in my case, go to a good high school and do well in high school and be involved so that you can get into a good college. And when you're in college, study hard and be involved in activities so that you can get a good first job. Make sure you choose the right profession so that puts you in a position to go get a graduate degree. And, after that, go and be quote unquote successful. Right. And so that was what I did. And that was what I really optimized for in terms of the steps that I made along the way, whether it was going to a good college, and after going to a good college, like entering the management consulting profession and doing management consulting, and specifically picking a company who I knew would pay for and support my decision to go to grad school, going to grad school and doing well, going back to consulting, and then, eventually making a move and transition to working in the tech world. And so definitely felt like in a lot of ways, I was kind of going on a traditional quote unquote path. But certainly there were stops along the way where I definitely had some moments where I began to think differently and think more expansively, more creatively about what a career could be. And that is certainly what motivates me in terms of the role that I'm in today, but also what I do today and what I encourage companies and people to think about as they develop leaders and as people develop their own careers.
That's awesome. From there, I mean, yeah, your educational background, you did undergrad at Boston College, correct?
Yes.
And after that, you then, like you said, you went to Deloitte, did the thing for a couple of years, got sent around, got the joy of lots and lots of frequent flyer miles, and then decided to go back to school at UNC Chapel Hill, full-time day, which is a different kind of program from being a part-time MBA person. And then you went back to Deloitte, and all that was still part of the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing for me, which I think having talked to many people about their careers, particularly those who are high achievers, is that in many ways, again, this is all part of the playbook that you've been optimizing for and that you've been trained to optimize for. And that, in my case, I mean, if someone told me at one point, I think the word that they used when they described how I made my career decisions, I think the word was surgical. And, and it was very intentional, surgical by design. And that didn't mean that it wasn't hard. It didn't mean that there weren't challenges. It didn't mean that there weren't setbacks in the moment. But on the surface level, at least, I was taking all the steps and checking all the boxes that I thought I needed to, and to a certain degree that I wanted to check. And I do think, though, that was driven by a lot of, when I looked out around me, that was what I interpreted quote unquote success to be like.
Right. So you did the thing, you did the management consulting, which pretty much every MBA student is encouraged to do, myself included. I chose not to because I was already a good decade into my career when I got my MBA, but there were plenty of people around me that that was the deal and that was the goal. And then from there, because if you've never done management consulting, you can only do it for so long. I think it's like 1 out of 8 people manage to make a long-term career. Like Tim's the only person I know. Tim is the only person I know that's still in it. And bless him for his endurance, man. And then after that, you decided to exit to Salesforce and go into tech, correct? And that was another purposeful decision.
It was. I knew when I was in business school that when I was in business school, that was going to be a time for me to explore a little bit and to look at other opportunities. That's the whole point of one of the reasons why you or a lot of people choose to do and opt to do the full-time MBA program is the chance to pivot into a different profession or industry and
Right.
to get the chance to explore that, to gain the skills to do that. And so at the time, like when I was working in consulting, I did work with a lot of tech companies. And so naturally, one of those hypotheses for me was, oh, maybe I could potentially work in tech one day. I think I always knew I wasn't necessarily cut out for consulting for the longer term. I think I did know that, but I knew that I was going to stay in it for a while. And so when I was in business school, I interned at Salesforce and had a good experience, but ultimately went back to Deloitte. But yes, after I realized and got to a point where I was ready and excited about moving on from consulting, the very natural next step was, okay, well, if I want to go work in tech, where are companies that I could go work? And by the very nature of having interned there before, having done a little bit of work with Salesforce, it became very clear to me that that would be a really good opportunity. And yeah, I went in to go and do it. And it's funny, I mean, on paper, this all makes sense, right? And it's easy to connect the dots in hindsight. Not that I want to give myself credit here, because like that's not what this is about, but yeah, like I think there is a part and a good lesson to be learned from that move, that there are times when if you do things that feel like they're the right actions in the moment, you may not always see the benefits of them right away, but over time they might come back to help you. And that certainly was the case in terms of making that move. When it came time to like actually make the move over to Salesforce, I was fortunate that there were some people who were able to kind of show me a couple opportunities to kind of make some introductions, to write referrals on my behalf and all those types of things. And so, yeah, that move was pretty, again, keep going back to that word, surgical, like it, for lack of a better word.
And because that's what we're taught. Like I've sat on both sides. I've sat there as the wacky weirdo with a BFA, and I've sat there as the person who is doing her MBA and watching everybody else trot towards the path that you did. Like I literally watched classmates have a nervous breakdown because they thought that having liberal arts students in their cohort was going to drive down the value of their MBA as a whole, and they would not get their consulting job. Like I watched somebody do that in public at one point. So this is, for a lot of people, this is the thing, and this is what they worry about. So you did the thing, you lived the dream, so to speak, and you got to Salesforce, you have the tech job, you have the consulting background, you have the MBA, and then you just had this moment of, now what?
Yeah.
Right?
Nope. That's exactly it. So after about a year there or so, first year was great. Really enjoyed it. I was learning. Really liked my colleagues. Also liked having a little bit of a life again outside of work.
Not
or actually, no, for the
anymore.
yes, exactly. Or at least a life for the first time outside of work. It was something I never experienced before, but I was fortunate. A little bit over a year in, I was fortunate to get promoted, and I was in this new role, taking on these new things. And I kind of did have like a moment of, at the time, I think I probably was close to about 30 years old. And I looked back on my life and, like we were talking about at the beginning, like I realized like I had followed the playbook. Like I had literally set out to do what, when I was a teenager, I think I realized I needed to do, which was go to a good college, do well in college, get to a good first company, get to a good grad school, and go and get an MBA, and then you'd be quote unquote successful. And by all accounts, like in many respects, like I had a great job. I was earning a good living. I was living in San Francisco. I was, had good friends. Like there was a lot of really, really positive things. But when I looked at it from the lens of I was, a senior product marketer, like in a tech company at the time of about 40,000 employees, wasn't going to be the CEO anytime soon. But certainly, in many cases, like felt like a number. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, is this it? Like, is this what I'm meant to be doing? Is this like what the next 30 years of my career or whatever it ends up being? Is that really like, is this what it's going to be like? And also, I know that this was the path that I said that I wanted when or I thought I needed to follow when I was younger, but like, does that still apply? Right? Or like, what does that even mean now when I went and did a lot of the things that I was supposed to do? And that I thought I needed to do. And that by some of the very nature, like are good things. But here I am with at least 30 years left in my career. And like, what the hell am I going to do about that? And so, yeah, it was really one fortunate thing about me, for better or for worse, is that I can be deeply reflective. And I remember spending lots of time really thinking about that and really trying to internalize that. And the very first step that I really came to the conclusion of is that was this realization of maybe instead of thinking about what I ought to be doing, was to actually think about, well, what do I actually like want to be doing? And maybe instead of thinking about like what other people think success are, maybe I have to go figure that out for myself. And so that's when the wheels started turning a little bit, and I started to get a little bit more exploratory and creative about what I could be doing versus like what I ought to be doing, or what the right measures of quote unquote success tell me that I should be doing.
Right. And so welcome to your midlife crisis.
Came a little bit earlier than midlife, I have to admit. The good news is it didn't involve buying a sports car or anything like that, or at least hasn't yet. So, but I guess there's still time.
There's still time. But you live in LA. Careful with those sports cars, man. The roads there are
That's
not
true.
good. I have seen many a person scrape the bottom of a Porsche. And most of the Porsches in LA are automatics, which is a waste of money. But that's another podcast for another day. So the good news is that you're willing to deal with the uncomfortable thoughts, but as you were going through and you've been doing the cookie cutter steps, you also, it turns out, had already inadvertently been working on what you actually wanted to do. So would you like to talk a little about that?
Happy to. So as we talked about, I went to business school. I went to UNC Chapel Hill during my second year of business school. So this, for the folks who aren't as familiar, during your second year of business school, there tends to be a little bit more free time in the schedule, particularly if you figure out, what you're going to be doing after business school in terms of having a job. And so I had some free time. I had exhausted and pretty much played all the golf that I'd wanted to play. And so I just decided that I was going to start writing, and I was going to start writing and blogging about my MBA experience, what I was learning from it, and how I thought it was helping me grow my career and help me grow as a leader. So I started a blog called MBA Schools, and it really was just a creative outlet for me in a way to hopefully make use of the time that I had. And so I started that in my second year of business school in 2014. And as I went back into the working world, I just kept up with the blog. I mean, it truly was a creative endeavor. I never really considered myself to be creative, but there was something about being able to reflect and write down my thoughts and experiences and to weave them into a narrative that just was really interesting to me. And even when working in a demanding job like consulting, I loved having some time at the end of the day or at the end of the week just to write. It was a really nice, just creative outlet outside of work. And so while I was working a job in consulting, and even while I was at Salesforce, I was writing this blog. And over time, it started to get a little bit of traction, primarily amongst MBA programs, as well as a couple of companies. And so in that space, a couple schools and companies would every now and then reach out to me to say, hey, could you come in and do a talk, or could you do a training, all related to the topics of career development and leadership development. And in many ways, those, every time, I got like a note that says, hey, like I checked out your blog, it's really great. Or anytime someone reached out and said, hey, can you come do a talk? Those were little signals to me of like, whatever I was doing was something that I maybe should keep doing, particularly if I enjoyed doing it. And so while I was working a full-time job, this was just marinating on the side over a period of years. And I think, if I'm being really honest too, while there was one track in my mind that was thinking about, is this it? Am I supposed to be working this corporate stuff for the next 30 years of my life? There was also another track in my mind that was energized by this creative thing that I was working on outside of work. And that was giving me energy and giving me excitement. And certainly happy to talk more about, the things that came from that in terms of writing a book and having a podcast and everything else that came as a result of that. But I do think if there's something to be gleaned in that, and I wish I had jumped on further, is that if you're doing something that you enjoy and it excites you, and how do you find more ways to do that? And I think that was something that really helped, because like I won't admit to be the greatest writer, but like I did really enjoy showing up and putting out something every week and seeing what could come with it. And so that was something that was more of like a grounding force, and perhaps also a guiding light into really helping me think about what else could I be doing besides the job that was right in front of me.
Since you live in LA now, I'm going to indulge my former LA resident and say, My meditation teacher, and yes, that's a real thing. If you can't see his video, but he's laughing at me because this is a very LA thing to say. But I'll send you his link. He lives near you. But one of the things my meditation teacher would call it, he'd say it's following charm. You're kind of like, you're following, this is charming to me, I'm going to explore it more. As opposed to, this is really hard for me to do. Maybe there's a reason that the universe is making this so hard for me. So I kind of like that for you, instinctively, you started to, follow that charm a little bit and open up and let it evolve for you.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of what I think that instinctually amounts to is that I have been someone who has always been able to, after doing something for a while, just to reflect a little bit. And even if it's a short little thing, just to say to myself, what was that like? What did I learn? What was fun about that? What can I do with that moving forward? So just being a deeply reflective person. But I think the other thing, which I will give myself a slight amount of credit for, was I think that I've always been driven by knowing that whatever I do could also potentially maybe benefit something that was bigger than myself. Right. And so when I did get those, even if they were little things like notes here or there, or emails here or there, or a talk where someone came up to me and said, thank you, that was really helpful, knowing that what I was doing, it was filling a creative void that I was lacking perhaps, but that it was also perhaps serving something else. Like those were, again, like maybe it's almost like there's maybe like an intrinsic charm and then an extrinsic charm. And in this case, like some of those extrinsic charms like really helped me realize that like this was not only just benefiting myself, but like this could potentially be making a difference that goes far beyond myself. And so I think that was when I started to see the potential capacity for that. Like I think that was really also something that opened my eyes of, well, what if I could do this in a more impactful way, or on a bigger stage, or with a bigger audience? And so, yeah, like I love that idea of following your charm.
I'm going to make a true LA resident out of you yet, sir.
Yeah. Well, maybe next thing you know, I'll be wearing that T-shirt. So that would really make it come full circle, or the bumper sticker on the car. I don't know. It's one of the
I'm so LA one. I think my favorite like screen cap of that was when somebody on Project Runway was getting turned down and told they were leaving the show, and they were crying while wearing the "I'm so LA" T-shirt. That's when what is it? Is it art imitating life, or life imitating art? Yeah. Oh, and I was just like, that's the picture, man. Okay, so one of the things that I thought when we talked about this was, you had said to me, you're like, you can't think your way into a new career. And a lot of people try. Like you have to run experiments and kind of see what works and what doesn't. So how did you explore that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think that, again, like I've highlighted a few times now, like I do have a strength of self-reflection. And I think what I realized was that you can reflect all you want. And I think it's super important. And I do think that there would be a lot of people who would benefit from being able to do that more in a lot of different capacities. But when it comes to actually navigating your career, you can't think your way into a new career or a change in your career or to growing your career. You actually have to do it. And I think I learned that, and I saw that just by the sheer nature of starting a blog, getting into speaking and training on the side. Because what happens when you do those things, whether they're intentional or accidental, is that you get feedback. And those feedback loops, what they do is that they open up serendipitous opportunities. And so the more of those you do, the more serendipitous opportunities you create for yourself. And so the very nature of taking that step and experimenting, that's what increases your surface area for career opportunities to come your way. And yeah, like it's great to reflect, and you should. And it's great to, if you're one of those people that wants to put together a career development plan, like by all means, like I still think that those play a role and are important. But yeah, like you have to at some point act your way into a new career. Like you can't just sit there thinking and wishing and wanting it to. And so in many ways, every blog post that I put out, whether one person read it or 1,000 people read it, that was an experiment in and of itself. And every time I got on the stage, that was another experiment. And so your ability to not only that though, so taking that shot, but then having the ability to reflect on it and using that insight to then take another step, that can be super powerful to experimenting your way into the next step in your career versus simply just thinking and planning about it.
And I like that, because so many people are like, oh, I need to do this. I need to, like, just start. Just start.
Right.
Like I'm doing this. And I think the first thing I said to you when I reached out was, totally going to screw this up, but I'll figure it out as I go.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, like, yeah, I think there are people that are out there who, I think there's a small amount of them, but they're there who they know what they want to do and they're just going to do it. Right. And I also think that certain professions, you don't have to do this, but like it helps if you are this. Like if you know you want to be a doctor, right? Like by all means, like there's a pretty prescriptive path for what that could look like. Yeah. Although I would argue that some of that is changing, right? And like some yeah, exactly. So yeah. But for the rest of us, like for the rest of us who don't know, or for the rest of us who, if you go into that yearly career conversation and your manager asks you, okay, well, what do you want to do in your career? And you have that like dread of like, I don't really know. I think you're right that like the thought of it, the thinking about it, it's marginally helpful. But what you really have to do is to actually do it.
Yep. Yeah. And above all, do not do experimental surgery. Like I just want to, for legal reasons, I really want to emphasize that.
Exactly. Yeah. No experimenting there.
Don't call us. So yeah. Can you tell I spent a lot of time with the lawyers in my jobs? Don't do that.
Yes.
Yeah. I had a whole debate once about the fact that we couldn't use death defying in marketing. And I'm like, go ask the lawyers. They're going to tell you no. And the lawyers were like, you cannot use death defying in the marketing. All right. So from there, you made that jump, and kind of what happened when you, after like the dude who followed all the steps, what happened when you turned around and told people that you were basically abandoning the steps, kind of?
Yeah.
How'd that go, man?
Yeah. Well, in some ways it was surprising, and in other ways it wasn't. So a couple things I would say. So I eventually, the backstory or the other story around this was that in January of 2020, I published a book, and that was, as any historians know, probably one of the last quote unquote before times of COVID where things were quote unquote normal. But soon, very quickly, things became not normal. And while I would have loved to have done a traditional kind of marketing and book tour for the book, that kind of got put on hold because, for safety reasons, nobody was gathering. Right. And so what that made me realize was, okay, well, the original plan for the book, got to put that on hold. How do I take this and get it out there in another kind of way, which led to starting a podcast. And so started the MBA Insider podcast in the same name of the book. And initially it was really just to bring on people to talk about the book. And also in the book itself, I featured over 60 MBA alums. And so I brought some of the people that were featured in the book on the podcast, things like that. But what also happened around that time was that, particularly as things moved to virtual, both schools and companies were needing a lot of help when it came to having speakers and trainers come talk about career development, leadership development, working remotely, things like that. And so I started, even though I couldn't do the in-person stuff, I started getting a lot more requests for speaking and training. And mind you, this is all while still holding down my day job at Salesforce. Right. And so I soldiered on trying to do two of those things for a while. And for a while, it worked great. I would do my Salesforce job from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, and then I would do my other stuff after work. But after a period of time, I just began to notice that the stuff I was doing outside of work was really more interesting and exciting than what I was doing in my day job. And not that my day job was bad, it just didn't compare. And so eventually, I kind of just realized to myself, look, I started this blog in 2014. It's 2021. I've been kind of doing this for like 7 years as a labor of love and as a side hustle. Like, do I want to maybe take this to the next level? Like, what could that look like? What would that look like? And to a certain degree, like, yes, like it was antithetical to everything that I had always done. But as we talked about before, I mean, I had already kind of been reflecting on the fact of, was I really going to be working in a corporate world for the next years of my life. And so I kind of had these dueling, like, kind of things kind of coming at me. But eventually I did realize, like, I had spent 7 years kind of building this. I'm more than capable of going off on my own, starting my own company and being in business for myself. So in that respect, like, to other people, like, I don't think it was a surprise. But yes, in other respects, for people who knew me, because I was the guy who worked at big companies, I was the guy who was, on the track, on the path, so to speak. I think it did surprise them to a varying degree. In general, I would say most people were supportive. I do think that I've definitely had a lot of people say to me, that's like very like brave of you, or things like that, which I'm very humbled by. But I also think that, there definitely are people who do also say to me, like, wow, like, I really wish I could do something like you did. And I always, like, I'm very humbled by that, but I always want to say to them, like, yeah, like, and you can, like, what could that look like for you? Because, like, I do think, particularly if I'm trying to adhere to what we were just talking about in terms of career experiments and exploring and paying attention and following your charm, like, maybe it doesn't look like what I did, but, like, I think everyone should have that agency and autonomy to take ownership of that, right? Like, there's no reason that, like, it needs to be me, or that needs to be what I did, but, like, everyone has some version of that for them. And so whenever that comes up, I always really try to encourage back to them of, like, yeah, well, what would that look like for you? So overall positive, definitely a little bit of surprises, but people that really knew me, I bet they would say, and I know that they've said, like, yeah, like, this is awesome, but, like, kind of knew that this was going to be what was going to happen, although maybe not as soon as it did.
Right. So for people that don't know you, what do you do, Al? What are you working on? Like, you talked about you making the jump. What did you end up landing in?
So I run my own leadership training business. So I work with organizations to help their managers and leaders become effective managers and leaders, and really training them with the human skills that they need in order to effectively lead teams in today's world of work. In addition to that, I also do a little bit around career development inside of organizations. And so really helping companies unleash the talent of their people through career conversations and through career experimentation, if you will. And so really, honestly, in many ways, I'm taking a lot of the things that tools and practices that I've learned myself, as well as what I learned from interviewing hundreds of leaders and MBAs over my period of time, and working at companies that do have a lot of incredibly driven, successful, and capable employees like Deloitte and Salesforce.
Mm-hmm.
And now taking all that, as well as some of the other research and learning I've done, and going into companies and teaching their leaders and managers how to be effective leaders and managers. And so, yeah, it's I'm on year 2 of being in business for myself. Right now, it's just me, although I do work with a handful of contractors and other consultants and the things like that. And yeah, it's definitely very, very different being at a company of 80,000 versus being in a company of 1. But I do think that what I think I learned from working in the spaces I did for as long as I did, is that a leader can really make or break a team or an organization, and they have a lot of power. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a better workplace by creating better leaders. And so that's really the problem I'm after solving.
Especially since you've come into this and started doing these leadership trainings and helping to work through with this consultancy, you're doing this after COVID. And so in a post-COVID world, what are, say, 2 to 3 of the most common things that you see across organizations as things that you would say, if somebody came to you and said, what should I be looking like? I'm a leader. What, generally speaking, are you seeing that I should probably keep an eye out for?
I think the first thing is, there's a great quote by Marshall Goldsmith for one of his books, who is, for those who don't know him, he's a famous executive and leadership coach. But it's this whole quote of, what got you here won't get you there. Yep. And it's just this general idea that anytime you step into a leadership role, like, A, congratulations, B, you are capable, but the things that are going to make you successful in the role, in this new role, are not always going to be the same things that made you successful climbing up to get to the role that you're in. And so there's a little bit of transformation that you have to go to in terms of your way of thinking and then your way of operating as a leader. And so I think the very first thing that I would say to any leader is really that message. What got you here will not get you there. And so from there, it's thinking about really having the self-awareness to understand what made me successful and what are some of the mindsets and behaviors that now I'm in a new position that I need to change in order to be effective. And I think if you take any major challenge that is going on right now in the workplace, particularly that leaders are being faced with, so much of it really comes back to the fact that the ways in which they operated in order to climb to get to the world that they are in are not necessarily always the same conditions and ways that people who report into them also see eye to eye with them on. And so the degree that they can be aware of that and be informed about how that might be different for how they lead and make decisions, I think is going to make them successful or much more successful into getting to better outcomes, regardless of the decision that they are in. And then I think the other thing I think that is really like important and really, really critical for any leader for today's world of work, quite frankly, is just because there is and has been so much change and it doesn't seem like it's ending, it's figuring out how do you create conditions for any kind of stability or clarity so that your people can actually do the job that they signed up to do. I think like nobody goes to work intentionally like wanting to do a bad job, right? Like most people like want to go to work because like they want to do something that is effective and that is like impactful and that is meaningful. But there are so many things that get in the way of people really being able to get that work done and across a number of different dimensions. Right. And so much of that really stems from a lot of the changes that we've all had to deal and operate with. So the degree that a leader can understand and really hone in on in this world of change, what are the things that I can do to provide clarity or stability so my people can actually do their job, right? Like I think that's going to make them much more successful in getting to an outcome that they want. And also it's going to help your employees get things done, but also maybe feel engaged or excited about the work that they do versus feeling drained, by it or hating it.
Right. No, that makes sense. So you go in, you help people learn to be better leaders. And from there, what did you mean? Like the thing that pings me also is when you talk about career experiments. So can you give me an idea of what you're talking about when you're saying you help companies to have career experimentation so their employees can expand? What does that mean?
Sure. So one of the things that we know from the research is that in particular, the people manager of a team, or perhaps the people manager for first-line employees, plays an outsized impact in terms of how an employee feels about their experience at work, which also leads to engagement, retention, all those types of things.
Right.
And so knowing that, one of the things that I really focus on in organizations is helping organizations figure out how they can help their employees feel like they have career development and growth. Because while the manager plays that critical role in that employee's experience, what we know about employees is that many of them also want to grow in their careers, but do not always feel like they get that support from the organization as well as from the manager. There's a lot of research that shows that the reason why employees pick organizations is also very much the reason why they choose to leave them, which is, am I growing? And do I have opportunities for advancement? And so what I am advocating for in the work that I do is kind of intersecting those 2 points. How do we help managers be more effective in how they put their employees in positions to advance and grow their careers so that the employee can feel engaged and excited and feels like they have a path for growth, but also in a way that helps the manager achieve the goals of the team. And one of the ways in which we do that is through career experiments. So the idea behind a career experiment is kind of like going back to, I don't know, like middle school, high school, or science class, right? In terms of the scientific method. So just like in the scientific method, we oftentimes come up with a hypothesis and we then go and run a test to prove it to be true or false. We can kind of use that same approach to thinking about opportunities for growth in our careers. So we can come up with our own career experiments, if you will, where we design a career hypothesis, test it through some kind of test, get a learning from it, and then figure out how we use that learning either in our existing day job or maybe perhaps working towards another role or through some kind of endeavor. So it was a really simple and small example. Back when I was at Salesforce, one of the career experiments that I ran was that my hypothesis was that I was really, really interested in, at that point in time, rising up the leader to become a product marketing leader in my organization. One of the hypotheses I had was that in order for me to actually do that, I needed to pick up maybe 2 or 3 other skills. And one of those skills was demand generation, something that every marketer probably needs to have. So once I knew that that was my hypothesis, then my goal was to go out to run a test. Do I actually like demand generation? Will I actually be good at it? Is it something that I want, a skill that I want to continue building? And so from there, it was like, okay, so what are the tests I can run to do that? You know, one test was talking to 5 product marketing leaders who also had, you know, expertise in demand gen. One experiment was taking on a project working with the demand gen team to actually get some hands-on experiment. One other, you know, experiment could have been that I ran was, you know, actually like trying to like put this into practice myself, like, you know, opening up my own consulting LLC and seeing if I could go and get a client. I mean, that's the ultimate test of like demand gen to a certain degree.
Yep.
But the point of it is that I had a hypothesis about how I wanted to grow. I figured out what are some tests I could run to go figure out if this is true or not, and then going and doing it, and then using that insight to then think about how do I bring that back into my day-to-day, whether it's expanding it in my current role or thinking about it for my next job. So that similar process is something that I do a lot inside of organizations. And I think it resonates for 2 reasons. One, for organizations who have managers who they want their managers to play a more proactive role in that career conversation, it gives them a framework for how they can tactically do this. I think the second thing that it does is that in many ways, it actually breeds innovation, because what actually ends up happening a lot of times is that people start to come up with these experiments, if you will, that, yeah, they help them. But what it actually also helps do is that a lot of times it helps them figure out, how do I innovate in the role that I'm already in?
Right.
It, you know, career growth doesn't always mean taking on a new role or getting to the next level. It could simply mean just being better at what you're doing right now within where you are, just in an adjacent space or an existing kind of thing. And so that is what I mean by career experiments, though. And I think it gets back to something we said earlier, which is it's really hard to think your way into career growth, but an experiment is a way to tactically act your way into it.
No, that makes sense. So with that, and looping back to everything that we've talked about today, I think the question I have right now is, considering that you spend a lot of time talking about it, and there are a lot of people debating this in certain spheres, what do you think, after all of this that you've done, after following the path and then ending up, shall we say, jumping off the path to make your own, what do you think is the value of the MBA that you got? And do you think it's actually worth getting an MBA at this point? I mean, you talk about it a lot, man. So, and there are a lot of people saying, do I need one? Or all sorts of people, you know, pitching the, you don't need an MBA, just go learn the skills. What do you think? Having done the thing, run the path, and ending up walking off the path.
Yeah.
So,
no, that's a good question. So with the caveat obviously being that everyone has a unique background and set of circumstances.
yes.
So your mileage may vary. So with that in mind, what I would say is this. I think given the pace of change, as well as just the advancements and opportunities that exist in the workplace, and also just the very nature of how we can be much more creative and expansive about careers, I think that all employees are going to need accelerators at various points in their career so that they can upskill, so that they can gain new expertise, so they can gain new experiences, to be able to either develop themselves, to be able to position themselves to take on new opportunities, or to make career transitions. And that's going to be true for the rest of their career. So what I know is that an MBA is one of the longest and most established, quote unquote, career accelerators, right? It has always been a degree and an opportunity that has been able to open doors to help people move from one industry to the next, or to be able to accelerate the path of someone trying to rise up the ranks. So it's always been one. it's not the cheapest one. It's certainly not the only one, but it is a known one that has a track record of, generally speaking, like having plenty of successes. And so I don't think by any means people, generally speaking, people have to do it. There are always exceptions to that in terms of specific industries that you're trying to get into or certain leaps you're trying to make. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty of other much lower cost, shorter courses and programs and things like that exist that are out there that might be able to get you where you want to go depending on what your goals are. And then that is another example of a career accelerator. So I think that it can be, but it's certainly not the only one and definitely not the cheapest. And so I would say that. The other thing I would say is that if you do kind of agree that with this idea that you will need various career accelerators throughout the course of your career, there also is a world where having some long-term value out of an MBA can be very valuable, because from my observations, what I have seen is that particularly for people who are making and taking their careers in lots of different directions, having an MBA can be helpful because it gives you the versatility of the knowledge as well as the network, right? Because every time you're trying to break into something new, or every time you're trying to explore something else, you're not starting from scratch. You either have capacity in terms of skills because of what you gain from your program, or a network in terms of people that you can reach out to and rely to. And so I think that there is definitely some value in the long-term, impacts of for those who are people who want to do a diversity of different things or are constantly pushing themselves to explore in different ways. But no, I mean, I think that there are plenty of people who are successful who never went to business school. And there are people like you and I who I would consider to be quote unquote successful who did. And so I think the binary conversation is always a tough one for me, but it is a career accelerator. It's not the cheapest one. It's not the only one, but it can be a really valuable one over the course of the career. That would be my summary of it.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I've had people tell me that they think my MBA is worthless. And I've had people tell me that my MBA is the only reason that I have the job I have now. So I just always find it interesting. I think it's a much larger conversation, and I think it depends on where you are and who you are and whether or not that fits for you. So
yeah, absolutely.
I was just curious to see what your opinion is, seeing as how you spend a lot of time talking about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So that is kind of what we have time for today. And for people that want to learn more about you, maybe people that want to listen to your podcast or would like to read your book and would like to kind of keep track of what's going on with you, how can, what's the name of your podcast? What's the name of your book, man? Let's take a minute and just, plug yourself. Go for it.
Thank you. So you can find me wherever you get your podcasts on the Edge of Work podcast. And the Edge of Work is a podcast for leaders who want to think differently to create a better world of work for their people and their organizations. So you can download that, listen to that if that's your jam. And again, wherever you get your podcasts, go over there, subscribe and take a listen, and certainly let me know what you think. You can find all the information about me on my LinkedIn page, which has more info on my book, MBA Insider, How to Make the Most of Your MBA Experience, as well as just all the other things that I'm up to and what I'm doing. Type in ALD on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only one. Yeah, that's where I mostly hang out.
And for those of you that are driving or listening to or using you shouldn't be listening to something else. You should be listening to us. For those of you that are driving or doing something else, we are going to go ahead and we'll put all those links into the podcast notes so that you can have fun and find out more about Al. All right. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening to the Lemme Splain podcast. And trust me, we will probably have Al back at least one more time. Thank you so much, Al. It's been great talking to you today.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.